Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing Oliver Harris's 2003 book, William Burroughs and the Secret of Fascination. In this book, Harris is trying to combine genetic criticism, where we look at the development of manuscripts and proofs and style and things like that, and combining this with a biographical, kind of fine-tooth comb approach to really figure out what makes a text Burroughsian. In other words, what is Burroughs' style? What makes it so fascinating? And also looking at, in particular, the importance of the letter in the development of Naked Lunch, among other texts. And I'll basically be looking at the beginning chapter or two of this book and then the second to last chapter of the book, which are on The Secret of Fascination and The Real Novel, respectively. And I think these give some really interesting ideas as to what makes Burroughs' style what it is.
Cut up experiments, phrases from newspapers, scissors, and cut these selections into pieces and rearrange
Then took
the
a scissors and cut
random.
these selections into pieces and rearrange.
Press when you cut into the present, the future leaks out. Some of the cut-ups and rearranged text seem to refer to future events. Backwards or forwards, or first there got new juxtaposition.
Harris states, "From the very beginning, I have not only been fascinated by Burroughs, but conscious of the fact and aware of its ambivalence. I was curious to know whether he held me in a state of inane illusion, or whether I was proving, as Akbar Abbas put it, a willingness to be drawn to phenomena that attract our attention, yet do not submit entirely to our understanding. Is fascination the necessary subject of an approach to Burroughs because it is a deliberate theme and a calculated effect of his work? Or is that reading only a ruse on my part, just an alibi to support an otherwise aberrant relation to it?" And I thought this was a very relatable way to think about Burroughs. There's something that entices one about Burroughs' reading. When you read something like Naked Lunch, for example, and you see the sheer extremity of the subject matter and whatnot, and the bombastic style that he brings, it's both matter-of-fact and extremely abstract at the same time. It is so otherworldly that it can use elements of this world, but make them entirely uncanny and unknown to us. And I think what's really fascinating about Burroughs that Harris tries to bring out is the relationship between the actual man, Burroughs, and the authorial persona. Because Burroughs is part of the Beat generation and really the oldest member of the Beat generation, along with Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, who are both younger than him. And Burroughs is, especially in Ginsberg and Kerouac's work, often treated as a sort of sagely figure, an old man that has all of this advice. He's someone that everyone sits silently in front of and lets him just deliver his advice. And this sort of textually mediated persona that Burroughs started to take on, Burroughs was aware himself that this was a commodifiable image, that to be an author, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, is to really be a commodity of some kind. And there's some sort of allure around the radical nature of Burroughs' work. And this becomes very complicated when we think about the importance of parody for Burroughs' work. He often called himself a parodist or a satirist in the style of Jonathan Swift. And in terms of thinking about how this narrows down his style, it can be difficult because we're unsure when to take him seriously either in his works or outside of his works. Whenever he speaks plainly, he often is lying or misconstruing. And this can really be traced back to a lot of his biographical details that are very important. The relationship to his sexual orientation, for example, is something that is far from clear. I always assumed that, he was this gay liberation icon. He didn't care what other people thought. But in actuality, in real life, he was this very timid man, very awkward and shy, very different from the kind of man you would expect in his works. Yet he also really loved guns, and he was into Wilhelm Reich and Scientology. He became clear in Scientology. He was interested in ESP and mind control and CIA programs of control and all of this stuff. He was such a widespread individual, and yet the ambivalence is there in the biographical details of his life. For example, he grew up in a very bourgeois background and really tried to escape that to become this liberated individual. But throughout all of his writing in his life, you can tell that there's some tension there of whether or not that's actually possible to escape one's roots. Does one's roots cement oneself in the ground in a positive way to ground oneself, or to restrict one from growing higher or growing outwards or beyond? And in terms of thinking about the biographical details of his homosexuality, he went to psychoanalysis for the majority of his life to try to get rid of his homosexuality. He was constantly, according to his friends, chasing girls, trying to play up this personality of the bourgeois gentleman, but in his writings, totally betraying this. And I think it's very interesting, and Harris kind of brings this out, thinking about what does Burroughs' style consist of. He says that certain repetitive and disturbing effects characteristic of Burroughs' writing, including the disturbing effects of repetition and recognition, are central. These uncanny effects, redolent of nostalgia but also of trauma, are in turn central to the experience of fascination. They are clues to our intuition that what produces the fascinating text, and is in turn produced by it, is a compulsion to repeat tied to a primal psychic economy. And that really highlights Burroughs as a person very well. There's this compulsion to repeat certain norms and to repel the repetition of others, a sort of traumatic response of almost blind repetition sometimes of this primal psychic economy, kind of letting things flow. He speaks of the partisan, fragmentary, inadequate state of Burroughs' criticism, measured by default the radical power of his work, a power at its maximum in Naked Lunch, and one that, to adopt Blanchot's account of fascination, I would call its immediate proximity. An overwhelmingly material effect that seizes and ceaselessly draws me close, even though it leaves me absolutely at a distance. The attempt to explain such an irresistible and ambiguous power is necessarily fated to end up explaining it away, which is why to recover the meaning of Naked Lunch is to cure the text of the very sickness that makes it what it is. And that's a very central aspect of Burroughs' writing, is to try to make it parasitic upon the reader, and to be malignant and viral and contagious, and for it to emanate a sort of linguistic sickness itself. It is a sort of diagnosis of the culture. In fact, Burroughs is often called an expert diagnostician of our culture, because Burroughs was at a very confusing time in history, where it was becoming clear through, for example, foreign involvement by the U.S. state in Vietnam or in Korea, or, all of these other places choose any part in Central America, that the U.S. state was not acting entirely to our interests, and thus there was a binarization, a sort of fracture in the center of the American consciousness. And this is something that is really trying to be reconciled with in Burroughs' writing, is how to hold on to certain aspects of our culture while also satirizing and making fun of others too. Harris writes that the logic of fascinated replication is apparent even when it is itself the subject of criticism, as in the closing lines of Timothy Murphy's Wising Up the Marks. Naming Burroughs, quote, an effect that propagates itself from medium to medium by the force of difference, end quote, he concludes, quote, even when Burroughs is no longer able to serve as the focus for this force, it will continue to reverberate, indefatigably sounding its critical imperative. Listen to my last words everywhere, end quote. We are brought back to personal magnetism, his first text that he wrote, and the occult fantasy of I am talking and you must listen. There was this obsession by Burroughs with mind control, of trying to use language to actually literally control other people's minds and force them to take him seriously. The irony is that even Burroughs' most astute critics find themselves in the most uncritical position, that of reproducing the fascinating voice and negating its imperative content, which is nothing other than a warning against fascination itself. When Sopizek observes that Burroughs' texts and ideas have insinuated themselves into the cultural fabric like an unobserved virus that continually replicates itself, what is extraordinary is the failure to confront the paradox he makes so visible. As Blanchot would put it, Sobieski does not see what he sees. That is, how completely Burroughs reproduces the ideological and affective power of the seductive image world, and how clearly his words insinuate themselves through critical and cultural reproduction. But to recognize this is still not enough, and it will be my case that complicity in all he opposes is the very condition of Burroughs' work, its material ground as well as its material effect. And I find something very fascinating about that you can find within Burroughs a mix of allure and warning. There's a very uncomfortable distance, that being a very close distance, a very personal proximity to very dangerous things that really takes us to the edge. Of course, he's, for example, in many ways romanticizing drug addiction simply by making it visible, by taking things out of the shadows and allowing them to have access to the wider cultural field. And in so doing that, he has a curious complicity, because you could say that in many regards, and this is often a criticism of Burroughs, that he encourages drug addiction. Now, by simply making something public, do you encourage it? Well, that is the great question. And that was one of the questions in the Naked Lunch trial, for example, was even if this is obscene, if it has some cultural and particularly aesthetic value, then it has some redeeming qualities that make it fit for public consumption. But the prosecution said that, in fact, this is something that could infect other people. And Harris mentions throughout the book that this was a key form of rhetoric in the 50s and 60s, was the idea that homosexuality was something that would infect other people. In fact, one of the things that was most hated about Naked Lunch and most objected to was the homosexual scenes, particularly in Hassan's rumpus room, for example. Harris mentions that the Burroughs of Naked Lunch, in it there is nothing metaphoric or theoretical or even reflective about it. His complicity in exercising power coincides absolutely with his writing because it marks the material point of origin. The traumatizing dimension of Burroughs' unique brinkmanship would collapse into no more than affected bad faith if all he had was a, quote, program in which retrospectively he finds himself pinched in a paradox. Right, because this would be to maintain the omniscient narrator perspective who is master over the paradox. No, instead, we find ourselves deep in a paradox. And for Harris, this is the paradox of fascination itself. Fascination with the obscene, with the illusory, with the phantasm and the chimeric, is that by trying to understand it as having some theoretical backing, for example, trying to parse it apart in philosophical terms, we get rid of the fascination. Harris writes that in the critical context, to approach Burroughs disarmed and seduced has meant taking him on his own terms and being taken in by him. Burroughs resists power to the extent that he also exercises it, understands power so well precisely because he has always worked from its deep insides. From the outset, this wasp scion of American big business, public relations on his mother's side, adding machines on his father's, was born to live out power's painful contradictions. His life as addict, homosexual, and writer literalize the undesired inheritance with a perverse vengeance, queering the legacy of Poison Ivy Lee and Burroughs computers by reincarnating it as a pathogenic cultural virus. And it seems clear to me from looking at Burroughs' biographical information in his letters that he was terribly conscious of that position that he was in, the WASP scion of American big business, as Harris puts it, where there's a complicity from being deep inside the most reactionary parts of the culture. And there's always a tension here because, in a sense, Burroughs' family is part of the kind of people who might call themselves the moral majority, a la Nixon. And yet, Burroughs is so against such a labeling, such a reduction to identity categories, for example. So the very paradoxical nature of control is that he's trying to dismantle control by showing how slippery it is, in a sense. He lives in his readers, as Harris says. And what goes for Burroughs' images goes finally for his ideas, too. In the last analysis, they are no more or less than material provocations, special effects, as all questions of content and reference come down to the irreducible fascination of a form. And that fascination of form is really brought out for me more in the Cut Up trilogy, because to me, it really connects closer to Burroughs' project with language, seeing the word as a virus and trying to find that the world itself is a cut-up. And I think there's something irreducibly fascinating about the cut-up form because it does bear that stamp of repetition. You'll see lines and phrases and single words. I think like como perros is very common in the Soft Machine and the Nova Express, like dogs in Spanish. And this gets repeated over and over and over. And of course it has sexual connotations because these people are getting fucked like dogs. But at the same time, it always has an uncanny sense of change as it's reincarnated in each of these environments. And to me, it really stands in relation to Deleuze's notion of repetition in Difference in Repetition, where he talks about the fact that every repetition, even if it seems to be of the same, is in fact a repetition which can only repeat by repeating qua different. That is, if I repeat the same word dog, 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 over and over and over, even though it may seem as if each of these words is exactly the same, that I'm repeating exactly the same thing, that nothing has changed. In fact, the environment in which I say it is constantly changing, the air into which I invoke those words, and also the fact that I have said 3 dogs or 4 dogs or 5 dogs before this current utterance or repetition of dog changes the way that you respond to this newest utterance, because memory is important. And that's very central, I think, to Burroughs' notion of linguistic memory, because there's a sense of control in that, a sense in which just having access to something starts to tie one down to a certain paradigm. And I really like what Harris says, that it may well be those who would gladly burn Burroughs who have best understood the unique force of his work. And so to exempt Burroughs from the term of his own critique is to miss the whole point of what I will be calling his textual politics. That is, not only his text's analysis of power, but their own relation to it. And that's something important. It is overtly related to power. There's a sense of complicity both of the author and the reader in something that they can't control. And the fact that he's able to be self-conscious and aware of that, I think, is really important. Harris says that nothing Burroughsian is abstract. I think this is a really good understanding of his style. The force of his ideas cannot be separated from the effects of his words. That's why his work can be so potent and so extraordinary, stamped with a strictly literal, overpoweringly visceral force. Whether it compels or repels, attracts or disgusts, When Burroughs' writing is Burroughsian, it bears the stamp of power and achieves the force of Blanchot's immediate proximity. I think of this as the immediate affective experience of reading a Burroughs novel. And I've done some lectures here on the channel discussing, for example, the relation that this has to things like anxiety and mental health. And I think it's a very interesting readerly experience. Harris continues, "For reasons that will become clear, my understanding of what is Burroughsian about Burroughs does not dwell on either stylistic features of writing, a typical array of images, a certain cadence, trademark structures, and so on, or on specific range of themes or representations. Rather, it turns on the textual politics manifest in Naked Lunch as the central point to which his first trilogy leads and from which the second trilogy develops. Control and its terrors are present rather than represented in his writing, produced by as much as reproduced in it. We grasp these terrors by the experience of being grasped by them." And I think that's really interesting because Burroughs' texts, in a sense, have an ontological primacy to what is going on in the text, because what is going on in the text is what is going on in the reading of them, and the reifying of them through the closeness of the reader to the text as it comes off the page into the mind, as it becomes mulled over, is that we're as much producing an effect as reproducing a representation of what those effects are like in the world. It's really a factory, and it's this beautiful textual economy. There's this notion that Harris really wants to critique here when it comes to understanding what is Burroughsian, because of course control is kind of one of his central concepts, is a lot of critics tend to reduce Burroughs' writing to the, quote, junk paradigm, which is to say that everything is analogous to drug addiction, that the addiction to language is addiction as the drug addict is to his drugs. But Harris writes that the junk paradigm is inadequate to Burroughs' understanding of language as a virus, just as it cannot account for the material force of writing I name Burroughsian. This force is based not on metaphor, not on figuring language as a viral disease, passively controlling the subject like junk, but on the literal practice, active as well as passive, of it as such. Burroughs always insisted word is a virus, but critics have taken his literalism as itself only a figure, as when Kendra Langeteig, in an otherwise outstanding article, speaks of word and image virus or its equivalent, junk. To say that the word is a communicative sickness was not for Burroughs metaphoric analysis or post-structuralist platitude, but an awareness integral and material to the act of writing, and this is what the toxicity of Burroughs' textual politics insists upon ad nauseum. What makes Burroughs so interesting is inseparable from his failure to apply or develop theory properly. And this is why, for example, he doesn't have this kind of brilliant narrative of perfect analogies that map onto each other. His cut-up project of the 1960s is a case in point. The priority Burroughs gave to experimental and material practices has been lost in the theoretical shuffle, as critics have reread his texts in light of the linguistic turn of post-structuralism, when it was precisely the lack of such a theorized context that actually enabled Burroughs' experimentalism in the first place. It is a major difficulty to deal with a writer so radically contemporary, who seems so perversely and unfashionably if not anti-theoretical. The word-virus relation is neither a theorization nor an allegorization, but must always appear to be so long as Burroughs' textual practices are assumed to perform an already well-theorized position. And I think that's really interesting, and something that we're going to develop as we go through this lecture, is that through the various extra-textual means, for example, going on walks or his letter correspondences, through these means he actually experimented. For example, he also in person acted out various scenes. There's a picture of him acting out a hanging scene from Naked Lunch, which is quite interesting. This really shows how the experimental approach was very key to Burroughs, where he tried to undermine authorial intention with, for example, the cut-up technique, such that the author couldn't impose the terms on which something is understood, such that hopefully the text might open up some future terms by which we can understand art at all. And I think that's what's so fascinating about Burroughs, is that you really have to jump into him at the deep end. You don't get any feathers, any floaties. You just have to try to drown and almost kind of enjoy the feeling of drowning. Now, since the middle few chapters of this book are just very technical and maybe not the most exciting to be presented here, skipping straight to chapter 5 on the real novel, we start to investigate Burroughs' Tangier period, in which he lives in Tangier, Morocco, and starts writing Naked Lunch. And in particular, Harris looks at the epistolary correspondences between Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg, and looks at the way in which we see this complicity with power really playing itself out. I think we really see a very humanized, and not necessarily in a good way, because humans are complicated creatures and not just good. We see this very humanized, fleshed out notion of Burroughs' relationship to his friends. In writing their letter correspondences back and forth, Ginsberg said that most of Naked Lunch came from letters, but Harris really wants to dig into that and see the truthfulness of that, and see how this back and forth economy of the letters really plays into the textual politics of Naked Lunch. In spring 1954, Burroughs panicked at Ginsberg's repeated failure to reply to their messages. He was traveling in Mexico, effectively incommunicado. And in this moment of crisis, it becomes evident that the only possible satisfaction for desire generated by writing is more writing. In other words, it is a matter of production of desire, not reproducing it by the letter. Burroughs doesn't write to Ginsberg because he already desires him. He comes to desire Ginsberg because he writes to him. Because for 6 long years he has written to him, knowing that his letters will be read. And the relationship between Burroughs and Ginsberg is very interesting. It's famously known that Burroughs had a huge crush on Ginsberg. You can see videos of them in interviews together where Burroughs is just so shy and timid. I mean, you can barely hear his voice is just kind of mumbling. I'm thinking of one where Ginsberg asked Burroughs, does he want to be loved? And Burroughs is like, not really. I can do without it, in his usual voice. And there's a strange sense of domination that starts to develop where the persona I mentioned early on in this lecture of the sort of sagely Burroughs gets replicated in the letters, and there becomes a need for Ginsberg as a recipient in a very perverse kind of way. Ginsberg writes in one of his letters, Bill is a power of solitude, got to give him all attention. And I think this is very interesting because that sense of attention is, of course, very central to what it means to be a public persona. So there's a collapsing of the sort of codes of the game between public and private that goes on here. Harris writes, the letter is an enabling device for the routine because its addressee, Ginsberg, is already integral and internal to the form. The relative economy of the letter coincides with the rhetorical economy of the routine. Replies are needed to maintain the flow of production, operating as a kind of feedback signal in which Burroughs' reply tests the line, as it were, confirming Burroughs is still on air. If Ginsberg can imagine himself as Shakespeare's boyfriend, silencing himself as a writer before his master's voice, it is because, despite his regular critical support and positive form of editorial collaboration, this describes the core economy of their relationship. Burroughs' desperation for a receiver, the passive end of a speech act, or better still, of a radio broadcast, should force us to revise what Elizabeth MacArthur identifies as the fundamental tendency of letters to engender exchanges. by already insinuating the unilateral force of Burroughs' epistolary transmission. And for me, this really bears on the whole master-slave dialectic that's very central to Burroughs' writing, of the relationship between power and the controllers and the powerless and the controlled. Because there's a sense in which Burroughs must become complicit in, for example, the word virus in order to dispel with it. He says in The Adding Machine at one point that in order to go beyond language, to rub out the word virus, you have to enamor yourself, overload yourself with words. Harris writes that in Burroughs' own diabolical pact, he also demands letters, but primarily as proof of receipt. This is a very sort of coercive relationship. It is one-sided in one way, reception, predictable, passive, rather than reciprocation, spontaneous and active, is the driving force. Quote, in some respects, situation quite horrible, you know, Ginsberg confided to Cassidy in May 1954. A kind of evil which in other situations I would not dream of putting up with or being cause of object of. In this case, not really dangerous, since Bill ultimately sane somehow. And anyway, I do not believe in black magic. But Harris says that the final phrase may suggest that he was in fact a little bit afraid of Burroughs' potential magic. We get a very revealing letter on the 7th of April of 1954 from Burroughs to Ginsberg, in which he says, I have to have receiver for routine. If there is no one there to receive it, routine turns back on me like homeless curse and tears me apart, grows more and more insane. Literal growth like cancer, and impossible and fragmentary like berserk pinball machine, and I'm screaming, stop it, stop it. Harris marks here how there is the absolute integration of the receiver into the routine, which is to say the routine's organization as an economy. And organization here, I suggest that we should think of in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense, of making something into an organ, in which an organ is a sort of input-output machine, rigidly defined by its structure and form to produce specific content and only react to specific inputs. It's a very routinized, rationalized, very sterile approach to an economy. And Burroughs is constantly trying to get out of a textual economy where, for example, readers can expect something solid and specific, and Burroughs can expect something specific back. It's almost as if he tries to pulverize his readers, and Ginsberg, by extension, in his letters, such that he can become some sort of empty recipient that can just be filled with ideas where they almost become a lure into a sort of sadistic experiment. Harris says that the letter has to be grasped as far more than a medium that enabled Burroughs to generate fictional material, a facilitating but essentially empty vehicle. Quoting from the 7th of April letter, David Savrin observes that Burroughs' letter to Ginsberg contains so many pieces of what will become Naked Lunch that he finally confesses maybe the real novel is Letters to You. However, these pieces were not so much contained in letters as produced through them, because they are a product of the letter economy and its self-divided, fragmentary aesthetic. To recognize this enables us to see how far the epistolarity of the routine form determines the textual politics of Naked Lunch. And what's really important to the textual politics, really the formal aesthetic politics of the epistolary, is this blurring between public and private we see going on between Burroughs and Ginsberg, and the strange complicity in which, for example, Burroughs really kind of gets over Ginsberg. Ginsberg almost kind of has to lie on his back and become submissive in a sort of almost erotic kind of way. Harris says that if the audience is an integral part of the routine, and that's from a Burroughs letter. And if the routine can endanger both performer and audience, it is also because the epistolary medium, whose principal message is the act of communication itself, dictates it. The will to communicate is understood as a dictation, dictated to the routine sender, who in turn dictates as the receiver. Reciprocity here is an illusion, since the dialectic of sender-receiver conforms to the model of economic exchange in which it is the system that reproduces itself. This is sort of like Burroughs talking about the autonomy of simulacra, who are able to correct for aberrant mechanisms and entities in the system, and correct for these through certain corrective measures built into the system itself. A sort of way of letting off steam by enveloping the periphery in a control mechanism. Burroughs finds himself, to recall the situation of Lee in Queer, condemned to transmit the discourse transmitted to him, forced to pass it on like a curse. And that notion of a curse is very important for Burroughs, because Burroughs always talks about being controlled and possessed by an ugly spirit. In fact, he went to several different lengths to try to get rid of this ugly spirit, which he saw as in some way the thing that killed his wife. He felt possessed by something that he couldn't get rid of, and this sense of close complicity is very important. This is one reason why the routine must have a receiver, or perhaps the receiver is necessary because it takes an other out there to unlock the secret other in here. As an epistolary terminal point for Burroughs, his, quote, only point of reference, end quote, Ginsberg structures the letter exchange as a kind of analysis by correspondence, in which the routine is offered symptomatically as an enigmatic signifier. I think there's something very fascinating about that. Harris says that in July 1954, Burroughs writes that, quote, salvation lies not in receiving love, but in giving it. Right? So there is some sense of participation by the writer in his work. Complicity by extension. Is this the generous logic, Harris asks, of the gift in its ideal state? The gift is the alternative to the dialectic of master and slave? Or should the writing gift be equated with an assertion of mastery, of power, of pleasure, of solitude, in which there is not benevolence, but terror? That's from Bautz's Lover's Discourse. How did Ginsberg respond to Burroughs' letter? Well, he said, quote, in some respects, situation quite horrible, a kind of evil, end quote. Burroughs' letter is nearer the poison gift than the utopian gesture. And I think there's something that we can understand why Ginsberg would retract himself from this epistolary correspondence, because of what Harris calls the revenge of the routine. The routinization of this communication created a complicity that Ginsberg recognized and wasn't sure if he could really deal with. Burroughs writes to Kerouac shortly after the 7th of April letter, quote, the withdrawal symptoms are worse than the marker habit. One letter would fix me. A shot at the epistolary would not satisfy Burroughs' need to receive, however, but his need to send. Quote, see that he writes me a fix, he continues. I am incapacitated, can't write. Tell Allen I plead guilty to vampirism and other crimes against life. So we can really feel the complicity going on here, the extent to which he's complicit in his own desires, in his need and his demand for communication. And this is something that Burroughs would later diagnose in Fatal Strategies, where he talks about one of the sort of defining aspects of our contemporary culture is the obligatory, necessary relationship we have to communication, where we are obliged to be transparent and constantly communicative to one another. Secrets and seduction is seen as backward or potentially nefarious, but we're comfortable in the open, or at least we think we are, where in actuality we might just be frozen. because Harris speaks of the diabolical principle that drives the epistolary machine. Like an isolated and unilateral letter writer, the sender can never receive, has to send all the time, and can't ever recharge himself by contact. That's all from Burroughs. And such one-way telepathic broadcast is denounced by Burroughs with unusual directness as, quote, an unqualified evil. He says, quote, we oppose, as we oppose atomic war, the use of such knowledge to control, coerce, debase, exploit, or annihilate the individuality of another living creature. Borrowing verbatim from his 13th October 1956 letter, Burroughs' denunciation establishes that it is a quite literal and material sending that underwrites this evil. So he saw the materiality of the writer, of his extra-textual participation in the crafting of the novel piecemeal, in a fragmentary manner, as both a form of complicity and escape. And I really feel like you can sense that tension in his writing. What is the master virus of the human species? The sender. Of course, the sender is therefore not a human individual, let alone a letter writer, but communication itself, which Burroughs always presents in the abstract, as he does control with the capital C. This seems to make each term monumental in both naively immaterial and ahistorical. But it might equally be thought of as a way to render the elusiveness of an always absent cause. As the viral or virtual real of cybernetic power, the sender is not itself fully alive or fully material or even visible, but needs human individuals to materialize communication and control historically and symptomatically. This reminds me of the alien organisms in the Nova trilogy that can kind of remotely pilot people's minds, but they hatch onto people with a consistent habit, such as a drug addiction or certain sexual practices or, et cetera, the kinds of things they like to buy, where there's a sense of continuity between those who are subject to control, because there's a complicity that humans have as a chain in this control, as a point in this control mechanism. Hence, of the, quote, U.S. drag, Burroughs insists, you can't see it. You don't know where it comes from. In the science fiction scenario of his cut-up trilogy, where the sender is now a Nova criminal, he would spell out the same analysis in updated form. Quote, you see these criminal controllers occupy human bodies. Ghosts? Phantoms? Well, not at all. Very definite organisms indeed. True, you can't see them. Can you see a virus? And I think that's really interesting. The virus is something that can't be seen, but because it can't be seen, it fascinates and allures us in a sense, hence our addiction to language. And this is really the kind of heavy-hitting part and the most controversial part probably of Harris's analysis here, is the centrality of the epistolary is most surprising in Naked Lunch, precisely because Naked Lunch is not formatted in such a way in which it would seem to come from letters. It's, in a sense, just a collection of vignettes with nothing to do with the epistolary. The only kind of to and from indication we might get is the Tangier, Morocco inscription at the very end of Naked Lunch, signaling when and where Burroughs wrote it. Harris says that in the case of Naked Lunch, the complete absence of the epistolary base exists in direct proportion to the ubiquity of junk addiction in both the text and its framing commentaries. Whatever the motives for its abolition as a genetic factor, the letter's absolute suppression from Naked Lunch has, however, had a paradoxical formal effect, precisely to forestall translation of the literal, Artaud's the very cry of life, into a rhetorical figure. That is to say, to foreclose the text's potential recuperation as a narcissistic narrative, like John Barth's letters. In this sense, Burroughs' generalization of addiction as private autobiographical and world medical crisis has had the effect of maintaining a psychology and politics intimately bound up with his epistolary economy, while avoiding the textualizing, aestheticizing effects of acute literary self-consciousness. So we get a distance from the means by which the text came about. In the case of Burroughs, the confusion of left hand and right, their virtual identification at a key stage in the evolution of the naked lunch, is an economic dilemma. This is because it announces a merger of economies of production and consumption, and therefore of desire and aesthetics, in unresolved conflict. I think that's such a great way of thinking about the conflict central to Burroughs' style. What one hand gives, the other takes away. Harris mentions the left hand, right hand imagery of, when the apocalypse comes and Jesus is going to sort through the people who are going to heaven or hell by placing the bad ones in the left and the good ones in the right. Now we get a very important letter from early 1955 in which he says that Tangier novel will be Lee's impressions of Tangier because I include the author in the novel. He continues, I feel guilty even writing this letter when I should be up to my balls in the work. But nothing is lost. A horrible vision of suffocating under the accumulated shit and piss and nail clippings and eyelashes and snot excreted by my soul and body, backing up like atomic waste. Go get lost, for Christ's sakes. I already made a novel out of letters. I can always tuck one in somewhere, bung up a hole with it, This is a very interesting passage. Harris remarks, what is apparent is that Burroughs' work, as authored and authorized labor, as a non-contradictory product fit for consumption, is forced to depend on its other, on the fragment, on the letter, on waste products. Nothing is lost, as he says. His own private voice, his own personal space of writing, the expressive and intersubjective liaison of the letter, all is fully implicated in the same total economy. This is not literary self-consciousness in any conventional sense, a turning in on oneself from a reflective distance. It is physical self-exploitation, self-parasitism, self-cannibalism. After shit, piss, nail clippings, eyelashes, and snot, blood is the significant omission in his list of bodily substantive. It is the work that is vampiric. Very, very interesting. You get that sense when you're reading Burroughs. You almost have to pace yourself because sometimes it parasitizes on your soul so completely that your complicity becomes bodily and you start to feel sick. And few authors can succeed to do that while still being aesthetically pleasing, still having some sense of merit. That's something that was argued over in the Naked Lunch trial, but I think that it's really clear that that is the key to William Burroughs and his Secret of Fascination, is the strange complicity and intermingling between author, world, and reader. And I think that Harris has very brilliantly told us that in this book. That being said, that's it for this lecture. Consider checking out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because I appreciate every single person who chooses to donate. It helps the channel out greatly, helps me buy more books, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.